thank you very much for joining us for another Q&A session at ICMI 21. Today we have my regular co-host, Natalie Powell, and we also have guests Ken Thompson and Robin Bowles. Ken, can I get you to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me to take part. My name's Ken Thompson. I'm in Sydney, Australia. About 10 or 11 years ago, my son was abducted from Australia by his mother and completely disappeared off the face of the earth. All the efforts to try and locate him ended up just with a whole lot of dead ends. The Australian Federal Police were involved, the Central Authority under the provisions of the Hague Convention were involved, Interpol were involved, but the trail had gone completely cold and nobody really knew what else to do. So I was pretty frustrated and I was with my wits' end. I didn't really know what to do, but I knew I could ride a bicycle. So I ended up riding a bicycle through parts of Asia, the UK and Europe, and I'd cycled about 6,500 kilometres when I got word that my son had been located in the Netherlands. And there was also a very large media campaign and a very large social media campaign operating at the time. And the person who discovered my son became suspicious about his situation and went on to the internet and found all the social media activity and realised that it was a serious case and contacted the authorities, and they in turn contacted me. And then followed a very extensive legal battle in the Netherlands, which flowed over into Australia as well. But fortunately, my son was returned to me in the Netherlands and we returned to Australia, and my son's been living with me ever since.
And Robin, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, hi everybody. I write books about true crime, and in my view, the abduction of a child from all he's known and loved and people he knows and his pets and his home, and away from one of the parents, usually the father, but not always, is a crime. And then I had a personal reason as well for writing the book I wrote about this issue, which was that my own grandson was abducted to France by his mother, and we didn't have to find him like Ken did. Poor Ken, it was such a marathon, but we did have to. He was taken to where the mother's family was, but we had a 5-year battle through the French courts trying to get him returned. But of course, by that time, he was only 15 months when he went. And by that time he'd been at kinder and he'd started to learn French, and basically the French court ruled that he had dual nationality. They just ruled that he was French. Why do we send him back? So it was a bit of a downer. But my son had to move to France. Well, didn't have to, but he wanted to, and he lived there for 12 years. And so I sort of lost him as well in a way. But anyway, all has turned out well, because we did eventually make contact with Dylan when he was 7, and we're in good contact now. And so I wrote a book about my son's story, but also incorporated a lot of other fathers' stories, which I found out was a huge issue in Australia. 3 times a week this happens, and you just think of all those grieving parents. And Ken read my book and discovered that.
It's absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? 3 times per week, and it really isn't appearing in the media. I think that maybe when there's a specific case, they'll talk about it. Other than that, it seems to be virtually radio silence, doesn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Can you tell them what you say about politicians?
No, I don't think I should say anything.
I think you should.
I think you'll find many of our viewers would probably harbour negative views towards politicians. So by all means, go ahead. Well,
look, the thing with Australia, it's quite unique to other countries. Within Australia, it's not a criminal offence for one parent to abduct their child. It's probably the only country, or if not the only one, of the very, very few countries in the developed world where it's not a criminal offence. The only time it's a criminal offence is when the abduction takes place when the when parenting matters are before the family court, and the vast majority of abductions take place without being before the family court. So that effectively gives the abducting parent pretty well a green light, because it's very difficult to get support to locate a missing child, particularly through the authorities such as the police, because their position generally is, well, if it's not a criminal offence in your country, then why should we be putting resources into it in our country? So you, from the moment you start the process of searching for the child, you find yourself coming up against this major obstacle that really creates a whole lot of problems. So, you know, have efforts been made to remove that obstacle? Yes. Robin's been involved in this for probably 15 years. I've been involved in it for about 10 years. We had a Senate inquiry. The federal government held a Senate inquiry into this issue. But at the end of the day, despite recommendations that were made to the Senate inquiry, the Australian governments haven't shifted their position, and it's still not a criminal offence within Australia.
And as you go on, Robin.
What I meant about tell them what you say about politicians was, if 3 politicians a week disappeared without trace, or you couldn't bring them back to their little cosy houses in Parliament House, there'd be an uproar. And everybody would be trying to find them, wouldn't they? But 3 kids who nobody cares about, forget about it. You know, I think it's outrageous, actually. 3 children a week. And we've got a comment from one of our viewers and saying that's such a high number. Actually, it's higher. Ken, explain how that 3 is arrived at, and, you know,
yeah, look, that figure of
number
3
is.
That figure of 3 is quite a conservative figure. And the reason for that is that I'm assuming that some of you are familiar with the provisions of the Hague Convention. That's the international agreement that is designed to enable children who've been abducted to be located and then returned to what the convention calls their country of habitual residence. The problem is that each country that's a signatory to the Hague Convention is required to establish what's called a central authority, and that's the authority that coordinates the search for the child. The only countries that have those central authorities are countries that are signatories to the Hague Convention. And I think it's just over half the countries around the world are signatories to the Hague Convention. So if a child is abducted to a country that's not a signatory to the Hague Convention, then the central authority doesn't become involved, and therefore no records are kept at the government level of those abductions, because they're not part of the convention process. So the conservative figure is, you know, it's probably twice that figure. It could be even higher, because the number of kids who are abducted to non-Hague Convention countries is considered to be at least the same as the number that are abducted to signatory countries. But that throws into light another kind of issue as well, is that most of the children who are abducted to convention countries are children who are abducted by their mothers. Most of the children who are abducted to non-convention countries are children who've been abducted by their fathers. And that probably reflects cultural and legal issues in those 2 different types of societies. But I'd say that number is quite conservative. I often say, you know, it's probably equivalent to about, you know, at least one jumbo jet full of children disappearing every year. And I think if we had a jumbo jet full of children disappearing every year, a lot of people would, you know, be up in arms about that, and they'd want measures put in place to prevent that from happening. But when it comes to children, the politicians, and it doesn't matter whether they're the left side of politics or the right side of politics, they're both the same. They just kind of have this attitude, it's nothing to do with us. At the end of the day, these are family issues and we don't want to become involved.
There's also, excuse me if I jump in, but there's also, we believe, quite a few who are actually unreported, because the people try to solve the problem themselves, or maybe they think, oh, we'll solve it in the family court, so it's not reported to the central authority, even, you know, depending on which country they're abducted to, Hague or non-Hague. So it could be even higher. But, you know, I mean, I do quite a lot of public talks about my books, and if I talk about this issue, I often see a person in the audience, because it's usually probus groups or, you know, older people who I talk to, and, you know, a lot of grandparents probably. And there's nearly every time, the audience is usually sort of 80 to 100 people. Nearly every time I see someone in the audience looking a bit affected by this, and I say, I'm sure someone in this room has already experienced this terrible situation. And, you know, it nearly always happens that it's correct. It's dreadful.
It's a much bigger problem than most people realise. And most people, certainly within Australia, when they realise it's not a criminal offence, they get quite upset about that. But at the end of the day, we just haven't had any luck trying to convince our government to change the legislation.
And as you were saying, that then affects the ability of Australians to go overseas and try to retrieve the children.
Yeah, well, see, I mean, you could almost write a book about just the problems with the Hague Convention itself and the way it works. It varies a lot from country to country, even though they're signatories. One of the problems that you encounter first up is that you need to know pretty precisely where the child is before a country in another country, before a central authority in another country will accept that case. Now, if you don't know what country the child is in, that you're up against, you know, that's a major obstacle to start with. But with some countries, even if you know the country the child is in, the central authority won't help unless you can actually pinpoint almost to the street number where that child is. Now, you know, most parents don't have anywhere near the resources to be able to do that kind of research and get that kind of information. So you tend to rely pretty heavily on the authorities, and the authority that you rely on the most would be the police. But as I said before, if it's not seen as a serious offence within your own country, then they are less likely to put effort into getting that information for you than if it was a criminal offence. I mean, you've got to look at it from a police perspective as well. I mean, they work under, you know, they deal with crime. And if it's not a crime, then they think, well, it's got nothing to do with us. So straight away, you know, you're behind the 8 ball from the very, very beginning, unless it becomes a criminal offence. Now, once it's a criminal offence, it opens up all kinds of avenues. And one of the avenues that opens up is Interpol. Interpol alerts can be put in place, and those Interpol alerts go to police authorities, you know, amongst all the Interpol countries. But the problem you run into there is that the only people who can request an Interpol alert to be put in place are the police. So again, you come back to this this situation where if it's not a criminal offence, the police won't request an Interpol alert. So, you know, you've just got far less eyes on the ground than you need to be able to locate the child. And while the clock's ticking away, the child is being hidden by the other parent. And one of the few provisions of the Hague Convention, one of the few defences of the Hague Convention, I think there's only 4 or perhaps 5 defences, is that the child won't be returned, or a court doesn't have to return a child if it's established that the child has become settled in that country.
That's what happened to my grandson.
Yeah, so the period that it's not actually written in the convention, and it's not written in any of the explanatory notes, but the precedent that seems to have become established over time is a period of 12 months. So if a child is hidden for 12 months, then the likelihood of the other parent being able to argue that the child has become settled has increased dramatically. Now, the abducting parents know this. You know, they're supported by, you know, networks of people that really understand how the Hague Convention process works. There's been a bit of a change in that regard. A lot of countries, including Australia, have changed the process. And what they're saying now is, no, the clock now begins from the moment the child has been located.
Oh, that's good. I didn't know that, Ken. That's news to me.
That's but not every country's doing that. Australia does it, the UK does it, Canada does it, New Zealand, but not every country does it.
Oh, okay, well, it's news to me. And I think also it's quite important for people to realise too that there's as you said, there's degrees of compliance with the Hague Convention.
Yes.
I mean, a country can be a signatory and then they, in that country, they have to establish what's called a central authority that deals with these issues. And then they tic-tac directly with the Australian Central Authority from the Attorney General's Department. So you've got that connection. But then some countries, they don't really, you know, try very hard to help you find the child and do all that. I mean, we had a situation in France where the French are not good compliers. They're given little labels like good compliers and bad compliers. Some are very good compliers, like New Zealand, but others are, you know, not that good. And we're unfortunate that France is not a very good complier. And in fact, our case was heard in the end by the local court in a little town near where it's sort of near Versailles, country town, by 3 magistrates who used to make decisions on, you know, car parking tickets and things. They knew nothing about the Hague Convention. And so you're in the situation where it gets handballed all the way down to a court where, you know, the judges don't know, don't care. And, you know, there's the mother tearful in front of them saying the father's an abuser or something. And why would we send the child back, you know? And so that's something also that you have to deal with. And of course, from Australia, where the parents, particularly the poor fathers, I do feel sorry for the fathers, I have to say, but the poor fathers don't have the opportunity to go over there and say, look at me, I'm an upstanding citizen, I care about my child, look what I've done to try and find him or her. And so on. I mean, they're painted as you know, wife-beating child abusers over there, and so how do they defend that? They can't. And so, and the final thing is that the legal system in Europe and in other countries too is not based on the British system, where you're allowed to have a lawyer and you go and give evidence and that sort of thing. No, it's all done on the papers. So the fathers don't have a chance to go into court and, you know, put their case, because they have to put a submission in, but then the magistrate looks at that, looks at this, looks at what the mother says. Poor mother, loves the child, took him away from an abusive father, of course he can stay, or she. So, you know, and then you get parents who disguise their children. And, you know, little children get dressed, if they're boys, they get dressed in girls' clothes. If they're girls, they get dressed up as boys, and they're disguised. And the other thing I wanted to just mention was about the Schengen States. And there's a group of countries in Europe. There's France, Belgium, Netherlands. I'm not sure if Denmark's part of it. That little of states where you can travel without a passport. So even if Interpol have put a notice, and what they normally do is they put a red notice on the parent, mother or father, and a yellow notice on the child, because the yellow notice is issued for people who can't speak for themselves. And they put those notices out. If you're traveling between those states, you don't need to show your passport, so the notice doesn't pop up. So you just can travel freely within those states. So you can move from state to state without any kind of restriction whatsoever, which works very well for parents who are trying to hide children. And there's, as Ken said, the networks, the underground networks of mainly women, I have to say, who have banded together to, you know, the I Hate Men group, and they support these abducting parents in quite a number of ways. I mean, they provide them with accommodation, they get them into convents and with the children where they can stay for a period of time where no one can ask who they are or what they're doing or anything. They can, you know, they can help them. I wouldn't go as far as to say they can help them with fake papers, but they can certainly help them find places to stay. And I know that Ken's son was part of that situation, and it was extremely difficult, you know, to locate him and so on. But anyway, luckily, an alert teacher decided to notify him, which was really, really good. But you just got to, I mean, that was luck, you know. After all the work and time and effort that he put in, it was a stroke of luck, really, wasn't it, Ken?
Yeah, it was. I mean, but that was the only way to kind of increase the likelihood of that stroke
Sure.
of luck taking place, by getting as much
Sure.
attention as I possibly could in whatever way I could. And fortunately, as you said, that particular teacher became a bit suspicious and thought, I wonder if somebody's, looking for this child,
Right.
and went onto the internet and found all the information.
So we've got a couple of questions. I'm just going to jump in. We've got a couple of questions from Douglas. So
Yeah, sure.
Douglas's first question is, how is it decided that a child missing is a parental abduction? Is that simply on the basis that the child disappears with one of the parents?
Yeah, I mean, the parent takes the child out of the country without the consent of the other parent, or if the matter's before the court, without the consent of the court.
Yep. And usually it occurs when a separate passport has been issued for the child already. So we've been off to visit grandma overseas, wherever it is, when the child's little baby, and then they come back to Australia, the family, and then mum decides or dad decides to take the child overseas and has the passport already. Although I have interviewed one lady who had a friend who was a magistrate, and she faked she faked the signatures on the father's application. It was a father actually who abducted this child, and faked the signatures on the application for the passport. And so the father got the passport and got the child out. But if they already have a passport, it's not all that hard, because, as Ken said earlier, most parents don't suspect. So, they do all this planning first, and then whoosh, they're gone. So it's to answer the question succinctly, it's decided that it's a parental abduction if one parent disappears with another parent overseas without the left behind parent's permission.
Just one thing about the passports. Australia is a bit unique in that Australia requires two signatures, or the signatures of both parents for a passport. But in many other countries, only one parent is required to sign the application. So that makes it quite easy for a child to be abducted from, say, New Zealand or perhaps the UK. I'm not quite sure which countries only have the one signature requirement. But so one parent in those countries can obtain the passport for the child without the other parent even knowing about it.
Yep. So it's not hard. They just rock up at the, and if the parent suspects, it's usually too late, you see. But if they do suspect that something might happen, and I get contacts from people quite often, and I'm sure Ken does too. I think my wife or husband is planning on taking the child overseas for a trip to Disneyland or something, and not coming back. And what can I do? And I don't want him or her to go. And so there is a possibility, if you have reasonable grounds, to lodge a stop with the immigration department. What's it called, Ken? I can't remember.
Well, in Australia, it's called an airport watch or a port watch.
That's it, airport watch.
So the immigration people will put an alert on that person's name.
Yes.
So if they try to leave the country, they'll be intercepted.
Doesn't happen very often though, because
Well, the tricky part about it is a parent can't contact the Department of Immigration or Customs and ask for that alert to be put in place. The application has to be made by a solicitor. So you first of all have to have a solicitor or a lawyer. Yep. You may or may not have one. If you do have one, okay, you're a few days perhaps ahead of the game. But that you still have to convince that lawyer that you need it. Then that lawyer can make an application for that alert to be put in place. But in most cases, the lawyer will want to go through the family court to have it done through the family court. And to get a listing at the family court can take days or weeks. There is a provision for an emergency application to be made, and that can be done directly by a parent. But it can only be made if the case is out of hours, and there is an imminent concern, imminent fear that the child is going to be abducted. So you can contact an after hours number at the family court. They'll put you in contact with an after hours judge. That judge listens to your case, and if the judge decides you've got a strong enough case, they'll issue an emergency airport alert, but it still has to go back to the court within, it might be a week or 2 weeks or whatever, to be formally ratified by the court.
And of course, all parents know about this, don't they, when they're in a flap and thinking, God, the child might be taken. What do I do? So I ring a judge. I mean, who knows that?
Yeah, and it's not easy to find the number, I can tell you. The number's hidden or buried deep within the family court website, or it was anyway. So, I mean, it's really difficult, and it's very difficult for a parent to frustrate this process. And if the other parent is determined, and if they've done their planning, which most of them have, they've gone before you can do anything.
Correct. Did you say you had another question, Robert?
Yes, so Douglas has got a second question here, and it's actually a third one's just turned up too, so from Carl. But I'll go to Douglas's next question. Australia ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, in 1990. The Council of Europe determined that the CRC's article that all children have the right to maintain regular personal relations with both parents means that abduction by a parent is a denial of this right. Could this be a better legal route than the Hague Convention?
The Hague Convention, I can't remember which one came first now, whether it was the Hague Convention or the Rights of the Child.
Rights of the Child.
Rights of the Child might have come first. And then the Hague Convention was established to kind of take that provision within the rights of the child and to develop that into an international legal model, if you like, to enable the child to be returned. So anytime a child is abducted, if you're going to make an application for the child to be returned, that application will always be made under the provisions of the Hague Convention.
It supersedes the rights of a child in one respect, in that it's more detailed and more specific to the abduction issue. But you're right. I mean, the rights of the child is very clearly states that it's, you know, an offence to deprive the child of their other parent. And the thing is that it's very difficult to implement an international agreement in a local court, you know. So the Hague Convention way is probably the better way, actually, to go.
I think it's the only way. I think if you're going to approach the UN, it's the only avenue you can follow.
I think, you know, we were just talking earlier about how would you know what to do, and how, you know, ring a judge or whatever. But there's some fairly simple steps, and I think, you know, a lot of parents go through what Ken went through because they don't know where to turn. As he said, you know, he's a senior public servant, he was very cluey, he knew, he was best friends with the Premier and blah, blah, blah. And suddenly he's got, you know, this terrible personal issue that he's trying to deal with and still do a very important job at the same time, which was very exhausting. So, you know, trying to sort of work out, what do I do? And really and truly, the things are, once you believe, you believe or know that the child has been taken overseas, you can find out from the Immigration Department if that's the case. And then the next thing you do is straight away, you make an application to the central authority for them to look at your case. After that, you've got a free lawyer on board that they provide you with legal advice. And the reason that Ken and I have been so involved in this issue for so long, I think, is that that's all they provide you. They don't give you any emotional support because they can't. They don't give you any other advice about how to care for yourself and how to manage your other kids and what to tell them or any of that stuff. They just do the legal stuff, which is, you know, terrific. It's free. They work hard on your behalf if you can, as I said, if you can, or Ken said, if you can give them all the details. But that their job is to do the legal work. And so you need a free lawyer. But after that, you need to still provide them with all this information that you have to find out yourself. So they're the steps. You contact the Immigration Department, find out if they've left. You can find that out. Then you contact the central authority. Then you get them working on your behalf. Meanwhile, you do your own research and try and find out where the kid's gone, because, you know, they're not going to do that for you. You have to be able to give them that information. So they're the sort of initial steps. After that, you know, it's a long process. It's very, very innovating.
So I'll get on to Carl's question in a second. I just had a quick follow-up question to what you were talking about then. Are there any good how-to documents or resources, something that's simple and straightforward and says, first off, but it's sort of very similar to what you guys were just talking about, actually. If somebody in a bit of a stressful situation, could they go to a place and find something?
The central authority has probably got some information, but you have to know about them. You see, a lot of people have no. I bet most of the people listening to this session have never heard of them before tonight, and they're located in the Attorney General's Department, so they do have information. Ken and I have been providing resources for many years for people, and both of us are reasonably easy to find, but there are other people who provide you know, dot point assistance, but I'm not quite sure there's a how-to brochure. Do you think? I don't think so.
No, not that I know of. I think, you know, the closest you get to would be some kind of, you know, summary on a central authority website, and I think that's probably within Australia anyway. Other countries may have, you know, different.
And each case is individual. It's unique, you know. I mean, there's some elements that are always the same, like the child has been taken overseas, but after that, you know, it can be anything. It's like a cauliflower, you know, it's got all these little flowers. Oh, it's awful. Anyway, sorry.
No, that's really good, actually. So I'll move on to Carl's question. No doubt there are certain countries where it is easier to hide an abducted child. Are there certain countries of origin where international parental child abduction occurs more frequently?
Origin or location?
Well, I would say he said origin, but let's assume both, actually, I think.
Okay. I might jump in on this one. Australia has the highest per capita rate of international parental child abductions in the world. Maybe not the highest number, but the highest per capita rate. Now, Australia has a good reputation for returning children because it's highly compliant with the provisions of the Hague Convention. Although, I mean, there are some cases where the child hasn't been returned for whatever reason. But I think, you know, by and large, the courts here will do whatever they can to try and return the child. But in terms of trying to reduce the likelihood of a child being abducted in the first place, we're probably one of the least proactive. You know, it's this really interesting dichotomy. You know, on the one hand, yes, you can't abduct a child, and we'll do everything we can to have that child returned. But on the other hand, we're not going to stop you from taking a child. So Australia has probably the, you know, I'm talking about the developed world. I mean, there are other countries where, you know, there may be higher rates, but within the, you know, the developed countries, the Western countries, Australia has the highest per capita rate. Now, Robin was talking before about countries that are like countries in terms of compliance. Now, I've over the years kind of worked out a bit of a hierarchy. You know, there are countries that are highly compliant, and they're the countries like the Netherlands, obviously, which is the home of the Hague Convention. And that's where my son was found, and I'm eternally grateful that it was that country and not some of the others. You know, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, the UK, I think I might have said. Where, Robin?
UK.
Yeah, UK. And some of the other European countries. So they're probably, you know, the most compliant. You know, if a child's taken there, you put your application through. Unless there are extenuating circumstances, unless the abducting parent is able to successfully argue one of those 5 defences, then there's pretty good likelihood that the child will be returned. How long that will take is another question. You know, they're meant to be returned. The process is meant to start within 6 weeks of an application being received, and ideally a child will be returned within 6 months. But some of these cases drag on for years.
I think it's important. It's important to say too, just there, sorry to interrupt, but the order, when it's given eventually, only applies to the child. The parent, the abducting parent, does not have to return with the child. So the child is ordered to return back to Australia. And if the abducting parent doesn't go with the child for whatever reason, then arrangements are made so the child is returned safely with an escort on the plane wherever they're going. So some people are nervous about making these applications because they think, oh, well, I'm going to force my wife or husband to have to come home with the child, and, you know, the whole situation will blow up again, and so on and so on. The orders are never on both parents, even young babies. The parent, the mother or father, doesn't have to go with them. It's only the order on the child. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, sorry. Just to qualify that a little bit, if there's an Interpol alert in place, then that
Oh,
parent
yes, sorry, yes.
will be extradited under the provisions of that.
Yeah.
But not every case has an
I was just talking about Hague.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So if you drop down another level in terms of compliance, you've got several of the European countries that are kind of partially compliant. Now, I think, France is probably one. Germany had a pretty poor reputation there for a while, but I think they've done a lot of work to try and improve their processes. Poland was notoriously bad for returning children, and I think it still is. As you kind of work your way, I guess, a little bit further south through the European countries, you get sort of lower levels of compliance. And as you move further east, you get into the, former, the Eastern Bloc countries. There's varying levels of compliance there, but I don't think there would be any that would be at the very high level. And then you get down to the bottom level where there's virtually no compliance at all. And that you would expect to find that in a lot of the African countries, South American countries. Very few Asian countries are signatories to the Hague Convention. But the one that has recently become a signatory is Japan, which has traditionally been a black hole for child abductions. They were under enormous international pressure to become signatories to the convention. They signed a few years ago, but their rate of compliance is extraordinarily low.
Really bad.
So I think a lot of these countries sign because they're under pressure to sign. A lot of countries that you would think you would classify as maybe not being developed countries sign because they need to sign UN conventions in order to get foreign aid for other matters. So it's like, you want the money, you've got to sign this, that, and that. So they sign, but they have no intention or very little intention of complying with the obligations.
Well, they don't even know how to.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
And as Robert said before, the legal systems vary enormously from country to country. In Australia, New Zealand, I think Canada, the UK, I think most parental child abduction cases are heard before a very high court. In Australia, it's a family court, which is a federal court. But in a lot of the European countries, as Robin said, they're handled by local courts that in the vast majority of cases would have absolutely no experience whatsoever with the Hague Convention. So they tend to look at these cases as they would, a local domestic, family custody dispute. Germany was quite, that's how they handled a lot of their cases. But again, there was a lot of pressure placed on Germany, actually by the Clinton administration that far back. And the German cases are now heard by a higher court. And all the judges who hear these cases are trained in Hague Convention cases. So since that happened, their rate of compliance has increased quite significantly.
That's one other quick thing that when I wrote my book, which was now a long time ago, we have known each other a long time, Ken, there were very few lawyers in Australia who knew Hague Convention law. That, there probably would have been 10, a couple, 2 or 3 in Sydney, couple in Melbourne and so on. Now, of course, there are many more. If you go to a family law firm and say, have you got a Hague Convention specialist, you'll generally find, on the bigger firms at least, that there is one there. There are some companies in Melbourne who've been terrific, and one in particular whose name escapes me, but anyway, she was really, really good. But yes, just finding the right person to talk to if you need to implement, further activities is also quite difficult. And of course, the central authority can't help you with that because they say, well, we can't give you legal advice on those sort of things. We can only act for you in behalf of the family. But the absolute, when if fathers get in touch with me and say their children have been taken to Japan, my heart sinks. They are not even allowed to see their kids. If they go over to Japan and they locate the mother and so on, the Japanese court rules them basically like a criminal. They can't go near their children. And then the wife gets, if it's a wife, gets full custody of the children in Japan, and father has no rights whatsoever when that happens. Not one. No visitation, no contact, no nothing. He's gone. Their children are gone forever. It's terribly sad. Now, I hope they're coming out of that hole a bit, Ken, and, you know.
Yeah,
The
latest information I've got doesn't suggest it.
Doesn't it? No, it's very, very sad.
But this is one of the reasons why people like Robin and I make ourselves so available, because it's such a difficult process to navigate through, you know, and there's little kind of barbs here and there, and it can't all be written out, you know. You really need to talk to somebody who's been through it or who really understands it to give you a bit of advice, and also to provide some support as well. It's a horribly lonely, lonesome time when you're going through this, because it's highly likely that nobody in your circle of family or friends is going to have any experience with this type of thing.
Right.
But it's very hard to find somebody who can empathise with what you're going through.
And, you know, the thing that really, really got me, I don't know how Ken, whether it happened to him, but, you know, my circle of friends, my girlfriends, who were all about my grandmotherly age at the time it happened, and this was my first grandson, and I was absolutely besotted by him. And they sort of sympathised with me, but, you know, they'd put their arm around me and say, "Oh, well, look, it's terrible, but at least he's with his mother."
Oh, yeah.
You know, and so it's not like a child trafficking person has taken this baby. You know, his mother's taken him. So, you know, that's better, isn't it? And of course, it's not better at all. But what do you say? You can't say, "You idiot, of course you don't know anything about it," but you can't. And so you're grieving internally, and you're trying hard, you know, through the system to negotiate the system. And, you know, then you're dealing with your friend's sympathy, which is really upsetting you rather than comforting you. And all you feel like doing is screaming the place down. And, you know, it's really, really difficult.
They're trying to help, but they don't quite understand.
Of course.
I mean, there's been quite a few studies done into the psychological profile of parents who abduct their children. And, you know, in the vast majority of cases, these people have quite serious underlying psychiatric problems.
That's right.
Which is what's causing them to do, you know, what they've done. Yes. And, you know, the child is at an extremely high level of risk while they're with that parent. Now, you know, during the time I was going through it, I was in contact with 2 sets of families where the abducting parent killed the children.
Yes.
That's
and you
how
can imagine
serious
what that does to a parent.
That's how serious it can become. You know, the other parent has these often deluded thoughts, you know, these persecutory thoughts. They're paranoid, and they're terrified that something is going to happen to the children if they're returned to the other parent. And, you know, it hasn't got to be real. I mean, it doesn't have to be somebody knocking at the door. It's just that, you know, the thoughts, the tormentors and demons in the person's head gets to the point where they can't stand it.
It's
and
real.
They'll see their children as being better off dead than being returned to that parent. Now, I was involved with 2 cases where that happened, you know, one where the mother killed 2 children and then tried to kill herself, and the other one where the mother did kill the children and did kill herself.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and it's real to them. That's the thing. I mean, that's not a criticism of the parent, really. I mean, that's how they feel. And the other thing we haven't touched on, Ken, is about maybe a touch on parental alienation, which takes place in divorce as well. And you might have done something on that, Robert, I guess. Have you already?
So, yeah, we have. We've had a number of speeches, a number of presentations on parental alienation, actually, in coercive control. In fact, it's been good, actually. We've had a variety there. We're running very close to our time limit. We do have one quick question from Carl. It looks like you wrote your book 20 years ago. Have rates of child abduction increased, decreased, or stayed the same since then? We've got about 2 minutes.
In Australia, they fluctuated. They were increasing quite dramatically for a while. It tends to be a seasonal thing as well. They'll reduce, you know, throughout the regular parts of the year. They tend to increase during the holiday periods, particularly the Christmas holiday periods. You know, people go back to their own country or their home country and then don't come back. I don't have the figures in front of me right now, but within Australia, I would say that they have been increasing over the last 10 to 15 years.
And so did you say as well between mothers and fathers, because when the Hague Convention was written, about 70% of the abductors were fathers, but now it's evolved into about 70% are mothers.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's difficult to come up with the figures, to come up with a definitive answer, because not all the cases are reported.
That's right.
Not all the cases are recorded as well.
Right.
So it's a tough one.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. We're pretty much coming up on our time limit.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Ken and Robin, for coming along and talking to us. I think this has been a really valuable session, actually.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Natalie. Thanks to all our attendees.
Our pleasure.
Lovely
Thank
to
you.
talk to you again. Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Thanks.